sea monsters. Hello. I was just talking about a book about sea monsters, and now you catch me out. I spent too much on eBay last night. I had one of those evenings where I suddenly found books that I needed. And as anyone who's seen my attic before, it means I don't need them anymore. It is properly break down the cultural differences in various different places where sea and lake monsters have been observed. So look forward to that Sunday Science Q&A. Anyway, welcome. I hope the day is going okay. We're sorry we're slightly late. We've got a slight problem with Erica McAlister's connections. Any of you who heard our fantastically enjoyable, to me anyway, episode of The Infinite Monkey Cage about flies will know that Erica was on that. And many of you wrote in to say, could you have given us some kind of warning, because I was eating a sandwich, and then we got information about flies, which was frankly vivid in people's imagination and in its rather grotesque nature. But we are also joined as well by Matthew Cobb. I'm going to introduce him. He's been on the show a couple of times before, and on many other things done as well. Helen Czerski with us. I will run through a few things before we actually get started. The new video is now up. Last week we were talking about bubbles and the frothing of milk, and Helen. Now, if you go onto Cosmic Shambles, and I will tweet it again afterwards, and I'm sure Helen will and others as well, you can see all things about the different, the nature of bubbles with different milks, etc. Will be fully explained. For those who are hungry for that information. We do use non-dairy milk at times, so those who are lactose intolerant are able to watch at least some of that particular film. Also, just quickly mention Patreon. We've got, if you can support us via Patreon, many of you do support us via Patreon already, but if you are able to, that is fantastic, because it does appear that it's going to go quite a long way through this second year of pandemic without us being able to do the job that most of us actually do. Certainly Trent, myself, Josie Long. And your support means we can still make stuff, and we're making more stuff than we've ever done before. I've got a new series called Tips for Existence that's coming up very soon, and that's talking about finding meaning and purpose in what appears to be a meaningless and purposeless universe. And I've got people like Tim Minchin and Neil Gaiman and Nicole Stott and Anne Drean and Francesca Stavrokopoulou and Anil Seth and many others on that. And we're also still doing the Uncanny Hour series. And if you want to hear a free sample of the Uncanny Hour series, that is actually up at the moment. That's about horror movies and strange ghost stories and things from television, and it's the Alan Moore and Stuart Lee and Reece Shearsmith and Kayla Janice and Joanna Neary and lots of others on that show, so you can find that at cosmicshambles.com. And as usual, Marion Keyes, by the way, was the guest on this week's Book Shambles, which is up at the moment, and she was utterly brilliant, and I genuinely entirely changed my idea of what her novels were like, what they were about, and she as a person is just fantastically curious and passionate about ideas. So if you get a chance, listen to Marion Keyes' episode of that. Let me just check the other things I haven't told you. Next week, sharks. We were going to do it this week. We're going to do it next week instead. And we've got Steve Backshall for that, and shark researcher Dr. Georgia Jones as well. Also, our friend Dr. Kevin Fong, who you may know from such shows as 13 Minutes to the Moon, which is one of the greatest series, if not the greatest series ever made, about the flight, the Apollo 11 flight to the moon. Kevin is also a full-time doctor as well, and has been very much working on the front line, and is someone who's really worth paying attention to, because of course there are so many columnists and hacks and tweeters with all manner of opinions about what's going on in the pandemic, and Kevin is someone you should really listen to, because Kevin is working in the hospitals. He knows what is going on, and go and have a look at his Twitter, because he's also put up a really good infographic basically explaining stuff about ICU and other kind of intensive care situations as well, which are currently going on. So have a look at Dr. Kevin Fong's stuff. And Helen's Christmas lectures are available worldwide. That is everything covered. Helen Czerski, how are you?
I'm doing very well. You just reminded me of my favourite thing about Kev, who's a good friend of ours, Kevin Fong. And he told us this on stage a few years ago at Latitude, when we were allowed to go there. And we were talking about people who deny that humans went to the moon, you know, the people who go, oh, it was all a fake and no one ever saw it happen, and they faked all the TV coverage and all of that kind of stuff. And he said that he was in the back of a taxi, and the taxi driver was, you know, giving him all of this about, oh, they all made it up, there's nobody alive actually saw it, we're all just relying on this footage. And his response to this is one of the reasons why he's great, and it is one of the most brilliant things I've ever heard. He said, Oh, do you think so? That's interesting. I think that about the 1966 World Cup, you know. I don't know anyone who was there. I don't know. There's all this footage that's a bit grainy, don't really believe it. And, and it's just, and he had a really, and it was just such a good way of, and then he said the guy went very quiet, as I remember anyway. So, yes.
That is such a great, do you know what? I totally forgot about that. And that's so brilliant. He is such a good person. And as I said, do follow what he's saying at the moment and the reports he's giving, because he's just a really and also the first time we had him on Infinite Monkey Cage was when Brian Blessed was on as well, and I knew what Brian Blessed called him when he stalled on stage, because I know that some children may be watching as well, and I don't want you to embarrass your parents because they'll feel embarrassed. You'll be fine with the language Brian Blessed used, but frankly in the radio theatre it was a rare event to hear that kind of language so passionately spoken, but because it's Brian Blessed it was entirely allowable. Helen, do you want to do your day in science now, or should we do it halfway through?
I can do it now. Well, because it sort of leads into the topic we've got today. So it is almost 20 years since the Human Genome Project was published. Now, that was on February the 15th, 2001. And we kind of take the human genome for granted now that, you know, genetics and all these things we know about. And actually, but our topic today is about flies. And so I went back in history because the human genome was actually the third, as I understand it, animal to be sequenced. The first one was a roundworm in 1998. The second one was Drosophila, the fruit fly. And that's where I went digging in the literature, because the Human Genome Project is quite recent, but the fruit fly is like right in there at the beginning of so many genetic studies. And there was this guy called Thomas Hunt Morgan in the early 1900s who didn't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution. He didn't believe that the small mutations could add up and be selected to cause evolution. And so he did what a good experimentalist does. He went nosing about in the lab, and his animal of choice was Drosophila, because you can breed them quickly. They're everywhere, basically. And he's the one that picked up on that thing that we've probably all heard about in biology class, the thing about the red and the white eyes, and that there's an inherited characteristic that you can follow down through the generations. And he found it was sex-linked. He set up this thing called the Fly Room at Columbia University, which is just a brilliant name. And so he went digging around. And so from being not believing in Darwin's theory, just 10 years after that, because he believed his own experiments, he wrote the book that basically set up the new genetics where chromosomes were taken seriously and sex-linked traits were possible, and this idea you can have two genes next to each other that kind of get inherited together, that's a thing. And so and he won the Nobel Prize for all of this in 1933. And I love the idea that he completely proved himself wrong, and he is now, recognized rightly as a very good scientist who did lots of things. But everyone forgets in science that it's not wrong until you've got your kind of ignoring the evidence. And he didn't believe it intuitively. He went looking for the evidence, and he proved his own first ideas wrong. And then he went on and, was very public about those ideas. And Drosophila there's been 6 Nobel Prizes based on fruit flies, work done on fruit flies. They are fantastically useful. The reason the genome is interesting is that we share, I think, about 60% of our genes with fruit flies. So we're not that far off. They're a useful study. But one of the things, there is a brilliant book written about his lab, and there were a group of, they were all men, who were doing these studies on flies and breeding them to learn about genetics. And the book is called Lords of the Fly, which I thought was just excellent title. So that's my bit of history, that the fruit flies, this simple thing that are everywhere, they were the way in to all of this genetics, and the Human Genome Project built on, and lots of other genetics projects built on that work. So that's my bit of science.
Brilliant. And it was something the other week as well, which is, unfortunately, it seems that a lot of the science curriculum in school doesn't have enough time to talk about mistakes and when things are wrong and the importance of being wrong. And that one day we'll do a full show just on those different kind of ideas curriculum. But that's such a great story of being confronted with being wrong, and rather than saying I'm going to double down, going, oh, this is going to create a very interesting story in my mind now, which is even more interesting. We're joined by Erica McAlister, who is a senior curator at Natural History Museum, as I mentioned before. She was on the first episode of this series of the Infinite Monkey Cage, and I would say, of all of the shows of the 150 shows that we've done, it's certainly in the top 5 for the greatest amount of reaction. People really, and there we go. And you think she was a physicist? by that cat appearance, but she's not a physicist. She definitely is. But it is this is great. I'm going to enjoy these Alfred Hitchcock style cameos from your cat every now and again.
Yeah, well, he's just Alfie off the table. It's because
I've
got a maggot. It's maggot. He's really addicted to the maggot, and he keeps, because it smells nice to him. I don't know why, and so he keeps coming up to the maggot. I'm like, oh, I'm gonna have to throw the maggot away. Sorry.
So, which is your show and tell?
Yes,
the
hello.
maggot or the cat or something else?
Oh well, I've got a proper maggot, which is like, and then I've got, as everyone has, some really cool pictures of flies. So,
that's great. Can we see that? Can you show that again? That was fantastic.
And how is that a piece of artwork? Is it a drawing from a microscope?
No, that's a photograph. It's a photograph of one of the flies that I'm studying in Dominica. And we're looking at the interactions, because these live on bats. And we're looking at the interactions of these species, what species we have, and whether they're host specific or whether they go on different species of bats. So, but they're amazing because they obviously haven't got wings or halteres, or, 2 out of the 3 things that we use to describe a fly. They just don't have those features. And this is what I love about flies, is they're just so plastic when it comes to their morphology. They're really quite fun. Their genetics, Matthew could tell you all about, and how exciting they are. But it's the end result. It's this external morphology that is just so freaky with flies that you can't help but love.
And how big is it, that thing, for real? I mean, I assume that's too big for a bat.
Yeah. No, I mean, they are some can get to about a centimetre. I mean, they're really big ones, but most of them obviously.
Face, don't they?
That beautiful image. It's in the Wildlife Photography of the Year. Putra, who did it, and it's this enormous bat fly creeping down the face of a bat, and it's the stuff of legends. Some people would say nightmares, but nightmares, legends, same difference. And it's just really amazing, and most of them will stay associated with their bat their whole life. They're completely adapted to staying on it. They've lost all their thoracic muscles because they don't need the wings. So a lot of them, their head, when not feeding, pings back. And so they really do have this kind of absolutely strange spider-like quality about them. And when you're trying to pick them off the bat, they do run around like drunk spiders. So you collect these at 11 o'clock at night when you're quite tired, maybe had a glass of wine yourself, and you're trying to not stab the bat to try and remove these little bat flies off them. So they're just really fun. And
what's the relationship between them and the ones you get on birds, like on swifts and swallows?
Very closely related.
They're very closely related, yeah.
Yeah, he's pushing the maggot off the table. Sorry. You know how cats do that? Gently push stuff off the table. Stop it. The argument is that they're in the 4 families within the superfamily, but people, obviously taxonomists, are arguing that they're all just one family. And this also includes the tsetse flies. So you've got the hippobosids, you've got the nycterobids, you've got those. And what's amazing about them is they all give birth to live young.
So the bat flies do as well?
Yeah. So she's got lactating glands on the inside. She's got tits on the inside, basically. And she will nurture a young till it's just about to, like the larvae, is just about to pupate. And she gives birth to this pre-pupate stage, which then immediately pupates. So it's quite amazing. And they only, on average, I love it, on average, they give birth to 4.5 larvae. I love the way you can, on average.
The thing is that after you've said such weird things about their morphology, no one's really sure what that 0.5 means. But my question was about, like, so is this a parasitic relationship, or is this symbiosis? Like, does the fly benefit the bat in any way, or is it just an annoying thing that follows it around?
It's annoying. It could be annoying. I mean, there are some flies that have a more commensal, a more mutualistic relationship with their host. So the bee riders, which are, again, equally adorable, they look like little teddy bears. They've basically got rid of all the features that look like a fly, and they hang around on bees, generally a queen bee. And the queen bee is a very messy eater. And what they would do, they would climb down and they will remove all the food around the mouth parts of the queen. So they are kind of like, it's like a glorified, like a beard grooming kit type scenario going on. And it does no damage to the bee. I mean, the Beekeepers Association used to be like, these are pests, these are parasites. And then they looked at it and went, They're not really, are they? No. So the varroa mite is, but these little bee riders aren't.
Is this going to be the next hipster fashion?
Bee riders. So love it.
In your beard.
I just like Matthew, can you remember talking about these with the hydrocarbons?
Yeah.
On their so they mimic completely the chemistry of the bee they're on, which we don't understand whether they're just smothering themselves in essence of bee, the new perfume that everyone should be wearing, or whether they're actually producing them themselves. This is yet to be determined, but it is one of the reasons the Queen just doesn't care. It smells like little bits of her running around.
And that's why the other workers won't care either. So one of the things in social insect colonies is that they all identify each other on the basis of what they smell, stroke, taste like. They have these sticky waxes on the outside of their bodies. And parasites or sometimes predators, like butterflies that will come in as caterpillars, and then the Alcon blue, which will eat its a whole ant nest of ant larvae. It smells, stroke, tastes
just like
them. And so the ants find this caterpillar outside. They say, "Oh, there's one of ours. Let's take it home." And then it just munches its way through their babies.
Matthew, let's find out your show and tell. I presume your show and tell is what you're wearing, because that is a beautifully flamboyant entomological shirt, from what I can see.
Yes. There's only one fly, which is some kind of gnat on it. I'm not sure if you can see that, but very, very entomological. Yeah, I've got an entomological show and tell, and I'm not sure where this is from. I think this is from the early 17th century, and it's a copy of some woodcuts that were done by a man called Aldrovandi, who published this fantastic book of insects at the beginning of the 17th century. And I picked up this page for, I think, €10 in Amsterdam, because it had been apparently ruined. So here we are. And then, as you can see, at some point in the last kind of 300, 400 years, some child has got some pink chalk, which was very much all the rage back in the day, pink chalk, and has coloured them in. And I thought that was absolutely charming. So it's a fantastic bit of a woodcut, and no flies here. They all seem to be butterflies and various other things. Although you can see, this is really interesting. This thing here, down here, is in fact a silkworm moth that's been dissected, and people got very interested in how the silkworm moth produced silk. And one of my favorite scientists ever, Jan Schwammerdam, he used dissections of the silkworm caterpillar to show that caterpillars and moths or butterflies are the same organism. Because until the middle of the 17th century, people thought that when the caterpillar pupated, effectively it died, because if you snip it up, there's a load of mush inside. And the outer, just like the caterpillar had come from mush, so too the butterfly came from decay. But Schwammerdam was able to show that wasn't the case, because in a silkworm moth, a silkworm caterpillar, which is about the size of your finger, you can actually see just before it pupates the soft forms of the adult, the head, the wings, the antennae. So he was able to prove that they were the same organism.
That's fantastic. It's a lovely thing is that woodcut, where when things become worth less because they're damaged, and I find that as someone who collects a lot of books, and to me the supposed damaged book is often more, like ex-library books, which are worth far less. But to me, there's something. I've got some lovely, I've got a first edition of Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea trilogy.
I have just started listening to that on audiobook today.
Brilliant.
Oh
series.
no, we're going to prove
series.
synchronicity and destroy the laws of physics again.
No spoilers.
But it's the book. I picked up very, very cheap because it's covered in library stamps. But to me, that's an utter joy that it has the imprint in the same way on that woodcut. The fact that there is someone else's mark there. There is something else. It's not just graffiti. It's a anyway. That's just my ridiculous thing.
I mean, our library is full of that. It's people who've written across their own books, which is amazing. And what we also do is everyone who, when they publish a new species, they send us the PDF of the original copy, and then a lot of people will take that printed out PDF and scribble all over it, saying, actually, I think the author's wrong there. I think they've missed this diagnostic feature here. So these themselves become as important. We really do have to rely on them, and I love it. Like, Swammerdam was very good at doing that, wasn't he, Matthew? He just wrote all over his books. He crossed things out. He has this diagram of a mosquito's wing, crap. And so he just stuck over it another drawing of the wing, which was better. And so, all of these little edits and scribbles and things like that are really useful.
I haven't got it near me, but the Tower of Physics, which, as we know, is a book which some people get quite cross about because it's this kind of the merging of Eastern mysticism and quantum mechanics, and I think most physicists kind of a little bit of it. But I have a lovely copy of that hardback, which is just filled. It must have been a reviewer's copy because it's filled with fury. And I remember thinking, I've got 2 copies of this book. Oh, I can't get rid of this one because it's got a very angry reviewer going, what on earth? This is a terrible comparison of mysticism and wave particle duality.
But the first chapter is a really good summary of thermodynamics, actually. That stands out. The first chapter is quite clear. Anyway, carry on.
I think it's a lot of fun. I think it's like all these. If you approach it with a lot of fun, if you want to approach it thinking you're going to form some kind of religion of quantum mechanics or write a book on quantum yoga, which does exist. Anyway, let's not get down that particular vicious. So let's start off biomimicry. Nick would like to know about biomimicry. Can I start with you, Erica? Because that's I presume Nick's. He said, "Can you talk a bit about biomimicry?" Which is a lovely open question, and I presume it's kind of talking. Perhaps could we start at something like Batesian mimicry, and just to give people an idea of.
So this is the idea that a lot of insects will look like a lot of animals. A lot of creatures, full stop, will look like things enabled to avoid themselves being predated upon. So the classic ones that I deal with are the hoverflies, and everyone goes into their garden and says, oh my God, there's wasps and there's bees everywhere. And I'm like, well, no, there's none. These are all flies. And so there's the idea that these flies are very harmless. They haven't got the stings. They haven't got the venom that most of the bees and the wasps have. And so in order to stop them being predated upon by the birds, they will therefore look like these other creatures. There's a little bit of I get a little bit sensitive about biomimicry because everyone just says the flies just always mimic the bees. And actually, when it comes to their habits, they are very similar. And there's a lot of features that have evolved because of their symmetry in their feeding habits. So is it necessary to avoid predation, or is it because there's some sort of co-evolution of the structures that they need? The hairiness is a classic example. Everyone's like, oh, the flies, they look so hairy because they look like the bees. It's no, because they need the pollen to stick all over them. That's why they're hairy. So, but there's many, many, many examples of biomimicry and different types of it.
Was it butterflies? I'm trying to think.
Yes, it was the Bates. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There's 2 kinds: Batesian mimicry and Malarian mimicry, and I always get them mixed up. I'm sure you can remember them, Erica.
No, I always get confused. It's because I don't like it, and so I just kind of because a bait is, and that's how it's easy for me.
That's just when you get a straightforward, like the hoverfly. You look like a predator. You look like a predator, or you look like something that can sting normally. You use their warning colours. And sometimes their behaviour. So some of the hoverfly mimics are absolutely extraordinary in the movement of their abdomen, which makes them really look pretty threatening. Moths do this; they'll look like all sorts of hornets and stuff like that, but they don't have the sting. And then there's the other kind, which is where you get completely different lineages converging on the same form that neither of them are they're kind of piggybacking on each other, and they end up with the same. Again, you get this in butterflies. And is that Malarian mimicry? I can't remember. Look, people, Google is your friend. Just go on there. That's Mueller. Muller. There's a nice picture of him wearing a fez.
There's a lovely, obviously the Pepsis wasp is the one that everyone is like, the Schmidt pain index. You know about the Schmidt pain index? He's this guy who let himself get stung by 78 different species of Hymenoptera
on different parts of his body.
On different parts of his body to work out which was the most painful. And this is a scale that goes from 1 to 4. I just still giggles at that. And he worked out what the most painful stinging objects or creatures were, and it was the bullet ant and it was the Pepsis wasp. Now, if you've seen the ovipositor of a Pepsis wasp, it's about so big, which may not seem a lot to you, but that penetrating your skin, it is very, very painful. And obviously, she packs a punch. So if anything is going to mimic, you mimic this wasp. And there's a completely vegetarian fly. It hasn't even got functional mouth parts as an adult. It looks really hard. It looks like one of these wasps. And then alongside it, where they live, there's this robber fly. Now, robber fly are highly venomous. Okay, and they've got new venoms to science. They've got neurotoxins. They can subdue their prey really quickly, and they have been known to take down a bird or two. So it's not exactly like their toxins aren't counted for anything. And yet the three of these things, they live alongside each other, and they all look alike. And I just, you just wonder why the robber fly, did it just happen to be like that in the first place? And then it was like, well, it just works. All of us. And I wonder if we go back to this area, if we go back in like 1,000 years' times, if every creature looks like this, as everyone realizes that eventually we should all just be dark, black and gnarly as this little area in California.
This makes me think about though is there a version of this mimicry for every sense? Because we humans are very visual creatures, so we privilege vision over everything else. But it occurs, I don't know, you're the entomologist, but the sort of their other senses, why are they not are they mimicking each other for their other senses?
That's what we were talking about earlier on. Yeah.
Why?
So
but we
mimic smells. I mean, we've talked about the mimicking of smell.
Hydrocarbons.
So yeah, the hydrocarbons. So they would do that. I presume there would be some mimicry in touch, would there? I presume.
Well, yes, I guess so. So the Alcon blue, for example, this caterpillar that smells / tastes like the ants and then eats their babies, it also stridulates. It makes a little noise like the ants are making. So it's imitating them all down the line. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward, because if you get it the slightest bit wrong, you get eaten.
Yeah.
So there's a very, very strong selection pressure on any any animal that isn't pretty convincing is going to get eaten. So they can't move from this kind of mimicry, this model, or that's it.
And this is what moths do with bats? It's the mimicry with the echolocation. So they mimic back the bat call, and they try and make it noisy. Now, I could be slightly wrong here because obviously I don't, but I believe that's what they do. So they kind of frighten the bat, going, "Oh, there's a bigger bat around here. I'm not going to worry about it." So they have evolved to be able to do this. And again, if they get that wrong, it's a short life for them. So yeah, it probably does exist with all the different senses. It would make sense to, obviously, as well, wouldn't it?
Right, we're going to move on to question 2. Because otherwise we're not going to get through all these things. There's so many interesting things there. That's why we normally do physics, not biology. Biology just opens too many, very literal can of worms with Matthew sometimes. Now I'm going to ask you this one, Matthew, because I know that you've looked quite often at kind of simpler brain structures. And James wants to know, do we know whether flies and other insects dream?
No is the very short answer, but I think it's a great question. We know that they show what people rather shamefacedly call neural correlates of sleep. Oh, if they go to sleep. So, if you use stuff like that, they go to sleep at night. You often see these fantastic photos of solitary bees clamping their mandibles onto a bit of grass, and they just doze off there. They're holding on overnight, and they just sit there, and they don't seem to react very much until dawn comes, and then they'll wake up and start doing stuff. So they're doing, they've got little brains. They can imagine things. I suspect they can predict where things are going to be. They can predict where objects are going to be in chasing them or whatever, or avoiding them. So there's no reason, I don't think, that they're not actually doing some kind of processing whilst they're in this quiescent state, which looks to us like sleep. I mean, octopuses, which are clearly a bit smart. I mean, but they are just clever slugs, don't forget. But they're a bit smarter than your average fly, I'll give you that. But there are
hang on, isn't that going to be quite contentious amongst that's
what?
Isn't that contentious? Isn't that contentious?
Fly people?
No.
Well, the thing is, octopuses are really clever. I mean, you know,
they are.
It's
the smaller ones.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, a pig's clever. Pigs can play video. Do you not see that the other day? Play video games. So the octopus, which is, I'll accept, is cleverer than your average fly. Yeah, but it is just a big slug, right? Just remember that. And when all these people say, "Oh, they're alien," well, you've got them in your back garden, except they haven't got 8. Their foot, because those tentacles, but their foot just divided. The foot, the bit that snail or slug oozes along on, it's just now been divided into 8 bits. Anyway, you'll have seen these. If you haven't seen them, go on the YouTube, dreaming octopus, and you can, you know, some octopuses can change their color quite astonishingly, their color and the texture of their skin. And so somebody's filmed one of these things at night, and it's sitting there and it doesn't care, so it's asleep, and it is changing its color, and it's clearly thinking about something. Now that seems to me like dreaming. If a fly can dream, I'm not sure. I don't think it dreams of your Auntie Jessie turning into a lobster, but it's going to dream of something. It will kind of replay things that have happened, you know, swatting movements coming towards it, or that spider it encountered and it wasn't very happy about. And it'll be doing something. We know that sleep is essential. If flies can't sleep, they die. So people have done it. My mate Jean-Francois spent years keeping flies awake all the time. It was absolutely exhausting. You had to stop them from dozing off. And they don't like it. They don't do well. So
what happens
without sleep?
Because I was reading Adrian Barnes, who wrote an interesting book called Nod, which is a great, very nice little novel where basically it turns out people just lose, they can't sleep. Something has happened on the earth, and it takes us through those 11 days as people go totally insane and everything falls apart. So I presume when your friend is observing the flies, as they aren't able to sleep, do we see erratic flying patterns, inability to interact with food thing?
Yeah, exactly what you'd expect. Their behavior gets more erratic. They get rather sick, and then they die. So
they're doing lots of these experiments in the space station. The impact of microgravity and lack of sleep is happening because of the changing in the circadian rhythm. And there's some lovely little videos of these flies that have been sleep deprived, and they are so groggy. They just can't process it. So they're not flying properly. They're not doing all of these things. They just look like drunk flies, which is exactly the sort of behavior. They are drugged.
That's like when they give LSD to spiders and see what webs they make. Yeah, that was
a bit disappointing. No, they just kind of, then they end up just sitting in the corner and proving on the universe. But the thing is, we don't know why we need to sleep, but it's clearly a major, at least physiological requirement, and potentially also neurobiological, whatever's going on at whatever level of an organism. There's some reason you need to either recuperate or process or cleanse, and flies, like other insects, are subject to that just as much as we are.
Brilliant. I'm going to throw a question from Stanley. His 5-year-old wanted to know this. Said, why is ice cold and fire hot? So I suppose that's, why do we, and of course that immediately becomes a subjective thing to some extent, but that idea of why do we sense something, why do we consider something to feel hot, and what is going on there?
So the answer is that deep inside the molecules and atoms of whatever it is you're talking about, there is a lot of stored energy in vibrations. And so if you imagine the inside of ice as a crystal, and it's got lots of atoms that are sitting in a fixed network with each other, and they're all jiggling a little bit, and there's energy in what they're doing. And if you increase that energy, our name for it is that it feels warmer. So actually, temperature is a measure of that movement. And that's all it is. So it's actually the case that an atom completely by itself in a vacuum cannot have a temperature, because it's not got anything to move. It's not got any vibrational movement. It's not bouncing off anything. So temperature is what we call the energy in a collection of atoms that are all jiggling, bouncing off each other a little bit. And so the reason ice feels cold is that when you put your hand on it, what you notice is that the atoms in your fingers are jiggling about more than the ones in the ice, and they tend to pass their jiggles that way, and your fingers, your nerves feel that loss of energy. And whereas if you put your hand close to a fire, the energy coming from the fire, some of that's radiation, so it's a little bit different, but it arrives at your fingers, and your nerves feel that you're gaining that sort of vibrational energy, and so you feel that you're warming up. So that's it's energy right down at the atomic level. And actually, the most brilliant thing about this is a thermometer. So if you find an old school, well, the really old school ones are mercury. Now they're in fact, I've got one here because I am the sort of person, that has this. I've just dropped it.
Yes, mercury.
So one of these things, there we go, you can see. So the reason that somewhere up here, the alcohol, because this is an alcohol one, goes up the thing, is that when it warms up, these atoms are jiggling about so much down there, they physically get further apart. That is what a temperature, you're seeing atoms get further apart because they're jiggling around. And that is what temperature is. It's that atomic scale. We call it thermal energy because of these little jiggling motions. So that might be a bit much for a 5-year-old, but something along the idea of temperature being about atoms and molecules jiggling in their environment, that energy, that'll be the way to go to explain that one.
I think it can be expressed through dance.
There's another aspect which takes us back to flies. So I mean, it's interesting. So I would have given a different answer to that. I mean, that's all true, but what I would have talked about is the receptors, exactly the things on our nerves that enable us to detect that hot and cold. And these are a class of receptors called TRP receptors. TRP is TRP, and it stands for transient receptor potential. And it was first discovered in Drosophila, in fact, in the Drosophila eye. So these are receptors in the eye that enable the cells to respond to light. But they also, there's a whole family of them, they also detect hot and cold. And one of the things discovered some time ago is that certain foods will activate those receptors. So if you think of peppermint and cumin, so cumin in curry and peppermint, they both, one tastes hot, the other tastes cold. Neither of them are hot and cold. And firstly, those two molecules are they're mirror images of each other. So they're identical structures, but they're mirror images. And they actually bind differently to these TRP receptors, which is why if you're having a curry, it tastes hot. And if you're chewing gum, it tastes cold. It's neither of those things. It's an illusion. Final thing is if you are eating curry and you want to, it's hot and it's hurting, don't try and get rid of it with water, because that doesn't work. So beer's no good. You need to have lassa, which is what people in India, because of the capsaicins, which are the molecules that partly cause the problem, are soluble in fat.
My question is, I'm trying to use my phone to get some questions in from Trent, but for some reason it is perpetually generating new empty tags, collecting new empty tag, and just says empty tag collected, empty tag collected, empty tag collected. I'm using a Chinese government phone as such, and I would like to know if anyone out there can tell me how to stop that, because it is now beginning to hinder my ability to read people's questions as they come in. So please, if you can tell me, of course, you won't actually be able to tell, because I won't be able to read it, because I normally read it on my phone. Helen, do you know why my phone is collecting new? You're good on this kind of thing normally.
My phone has never done any things, but maybe Trent can pass them on to me and I can pass them on to you. If maybe we can get there by passing things along the chain, like passing notes in class, basically.
That would be very useful. So now this one is, I would say, a classic one that Erica, you have probably answered more often than once. I would say this from Spider67, who would like to know: do wasps serve any functional purpose?
Yes, they serve as much purpose as humans do. Yeah. But if you were talking about their ecological role, they're amazing predators. Okay, so they're a gardener's best friend, because they go around getting rid of a lot of the species that we would call pests in the garden. So they are the females, obviously, it's just the females because they're the ones that have got the modified ovipositor at the egg-laying tube. That is the sting. They will go round attacking as much as they can, and this changes during the season. So because I presume we're just talking about social wasps here, because if we start getting into ichneumanoids and all of those, we're a completely different world, which is more exciting to most people who study insects. But if we just talk about the social wasps, the workers will bring a lot of food back to their nests to feed the next generation. So they will get rid of a lot of things, aphids and a lot of the flies that you don't necessarily like, and a lot of all these other creatures. And then during the autumn, that's when they turn to the little alcoholics. That's when they become the problem that people don't like them. Because during the autumn phase, the queen will chuck out most of the workers or they will die. So the females become jobless and they're homeless now, and they are feeding on loads of rotten food. So they become drunken, alcoholic females raging around your garden. And this is when they become slightly aggressive to us humans and start attacking our picnics and barbecues and things like that. So yes, they do have a really important ecological role. And we went to a wedding once, and half the wedding was entomologists and half was civilians, normal people, and you could spot them because the wasps were coming up to all the drinks, and there was half the group screaming and the other half were just gently moving the wasps away and covering up their drinks. They're absolutely fine if you're just very gentle with them.
And of course, as we know, Erica, you brought those wasps with you. You don't like talking to non-entomologists. The only way to do it is release the wasp. I don't need to speak to him or her.
Well, luckily there was 4 hymenopteras there, so they were definitely the wasp whisperers. So they were like, I was just talking to the flies, they were talking to the wasps. It was all great. It's perfect.
Please write a children's book called The Wasperer. I'd love to read that. Now, this one, I'm going to throw this at Matthew because this is your recent book was a fantastic book about what we understand about the brain and how much we don't understand about the brain and where it's going to go. And this is from Adam. And we were kind of just briefly mentioning about the subjectivity of experience. And he'd like to know, does the human brain hallucinate sound, the feeling of solid and the visual representation of our external environment? Outside the brain is our world a silent, see-through ball of trillions of tiny electromagnetic repulsions, giving us the illusion of a solid, visual and noisy environment. You have 2 minutes, starting.
Well, Bishop Berkeley had something to say about this, didn't he? He said, well, if a tree falls in an empty forest, is there a noise? And the answer to that question is, well, yes, obviously. And we know that on Mars. There's nobody on Mars, but there are noises on Mars. We can hear that from the recording that's being made. So I think there's two things. Firstly, clearly the world is not made of solid stuff in any way, shape or form, because although this table feels to me that it's solid, that's simply because of the strength of the atomic bonds that are holding it together and that are holding me together. And in fact, most objects are in fact nothing. And in fact, the atom is largely composed of nothing. There's nothing in there. There's the clouds of potential, or however people think of it these days. I like to think of them as little billiard balls whizzing around each other. But most of it is just nothing. So in one way, it's an illusion, but in another way, it's absolutely real. I mean, you can't put your hand through a screen, even though it's not solid. So there are different levels of reality, and our brains have adapted and evolved in order to enable us to cope with that, which is one reason I find physics difficult, because, I'm just a reasonably smart ape, and this stuff is a bit... We never met this on the Serengeti, We didn't have any of this weird physics stuff.
As nice little billiard balls, then you get to wave things. It gets a bit easier, I think. Robin, I'm getting questions coming through for live, so when you want some live questions...
please do. Please, let's have a live question. That would be great.
Well, there's one here from EV Guy who would like to know whether biting flies do or don't bite, and do any of them use anticoagulants like leeches and vampire bats? Do biting? Yes. What do biting flies bite? I guess that's perhaps the first question.
So an adult fly cannot really bite. It can slice. So, for example, if you've been attacked by a horsefly, you will know the painful bite. Well, they call it bite, but it's got some slightly sharpened mandibles. But they are still suctorial. So they can't actually bite into their food. So it slices your flesh and laps up. When they talk about mosquito biting, again, you've got these stylets that form this long proboscis. At the very end, it's got a serrated edge, but it acts like a pneumatic drill, and it gradually gets through your skin that way. So again, it's not really biting. So the term biting fly is a bit of misnomer. Mosquitoes, yes, to anticoagulants, because obviously she needs to suck up the blood. So she is definitely releasing that. And it is often that causes the reaction that we don't like.
Yeah, and it's also that's when she's gonna accidentally inject the plasmodium or the virus that will cause the disease. And on the end of that stylet, there's an astonishing video. One of these, some scientists have recorded this stylet, which you think of these things as being kind of rigid, but it's not. It's flexible, and on the end, she must have little taste receptors because she can wiggle and get it right into the tiny capillary, which is where the blood is, and then
absolutely, it's amazing, the videos of this, because it's totally flexible. I mean, absolutely. We don't think about this needle being flexible underneath our skin, but it is able to go around. And this is one of the things they're using for the development of smart needles. The idea of developing these sort of needles to enable us to get round really sensitive organs or tissues underneath our skin. So this biting mouth part, as it were, that everyone hates actually might turn out to be a medical marvel. And even the vibratory mechanism of her proboscis is what we're using again for developing nice needles, enabling to pierce your skin with so much less force. So again, this is quite an important thing. We're thinking about mass vaccinations at the moment. Can you imagine how much nicer that would be with a mosquito mouth part?
That is fantastic. I love the images you place in our heads with your use of language and mosquito mouth parts. There is, as usual, Cronenbergian. Another question for this, Matthew. You're going to wish you hadn't written that blinking book about the brain when I ask you this one. What is the simplest brain-like structure required to be able to manifest consciousness or awareness?
No idea. Okay, awareness, that's probably, I mean, awareness depends what you mean, but conceivably just two neurons. So, one of the things that people often think about is learning. So there's a great experiment done in the 1960s by a chap called Adrian Horridge when he was in Cambridge. And he got a cockroach and he chopped its head off. Sorry about this. So he's got a cockroach and he in fact took its leg off, and all it's got is its leg like this. And he pins the leg to a bit of wood and he attaches a wire here and a wire here. And if the leg goes down, then it gets an electric shock because it dips into some electrified salt water. And so this little circuit of just a few nerves will very quickly learn to keep itself out of the water. There's no brain involved, no ganglion, no nothing. It's just a series of neurons. It will learn positional information. So it's aware of the shock and it knows what to do to stop it, and that's no brain involved. So I don't know, there's probably about 4 neurons in there. That's probably the bottom, the absolute minimum. Or you could even argue 1 neuron. So if you can see a photon of light, or you can smell, a cell receptor that can smell an odor or can taste salt, is that aware? I mean, if you want to get philosophical and say, yes, I've got to have a little maggot in there sitting, thinking about it, or a little mini me, then the answer to that is I have absolutely no idea. And you don't have a mini me or a mini maggot in your head. So maybe I think that's I'm not the foggiest idea.
But your definition. I was just going to say, those little boys I used to hate who lived on my road when I was growing up that would pull the legs off insects because they thought it was fun. They apparently all grew up to be entomologists in neuroscience.
Yeah.
Wait. We don't pull legs off for fun. I just want to qualify this. I did get told off by a once who told me I was disgusting because I cut the wings off flies. And I was like, but they're dead. I'm not doing it. Although I have accidentally pulled the genitalia off flies when they're alive. But these things happen. But there are some really gruesome stories about early experiments with insects. There's a lot of gluing insects to things to actually study them, aren't there, Matthew? And what actually you're doing to Drosophila heads right now is quite grim. where they just remove the head to look at all and attach all the sensors to the heads to see what's going on there. That's not politically.
Yeah, I mean,
I'm not helping my case here, am I? I realise that.
Well, let's just hope they're not self-aware. I think now let's hope that self-awareness debate means that as you were pulling those genitals off, they weren't. Oh no,
it was a pure accident. I felt horrified. I thought it was dead. It was, and then I realised it wasn't. I was just honestly, it was horrific. I don't like doing that sort of thing.
Happy Valentine's Day, everyone.
Yeah.
Well, if you're studying Drosophila courtship behaviour, one of the things you often do is to chop the female's head off. So she'll just stand there, and then the male gets very, very excited. She'll stay alive for about a day. She tries to clean her eyes because she thinks it's dark, so she'll spend all the time doing this, and there's no head there, and she'll just sit there. And then you watch the male running around, buzzing, getting very excited, trying to copulate, sometimes with either end. Sorry about that.
Yes, I think you should be. So the audience would like to point out that as soon as Erica started talking about mosquito bites, Robin started scratching his arm. So, I don't know if that's
I'm so easily psycho. So I itch all the way throughout Monkey Cage episode on flies. I was back to that urban myth that a fly had, there were eggs in my brain and they were hatching out and all. It would explain a lot if that was going on, I think.
When I'm not doing flies, I'm doing fleas. So my mother is just absolutely, she just don't talk, Erica, just don't talk. I'm like, oh, look at the way they jump, Mum, and she's like, that's it, they're everywhere. I'm like, oh.
I must say, I know I've recommended this to our audience before, but it's on YouTube. 7 Wonders of the World with Miriam Rothschild. It's an utter delight, and
I've just been listening to that recently, and she's couldn't be more of an inspirational scientist. She's absolutely fabulous.
She's amazing.
She is amazing, and again, she just carried out experiment after experiment after experiment, and she was just for the pure joy of it. She wasn't paid. She didn't need to be paid. She was just inquisitive, and it was like, wow. Plus, she's a bit bonkers.
But she's great, giving the little bits of chloroform to the fleas just to slow them down. All of that kind of. This is. Oh, let's see. We've got a question for. This is the hip intersection of entomology and religiosity. The Babylonian Talmud discusses whether the eating of parasitic fly worms in cattle is acceptable. I wonder if similar discussions, warnings are found in other traditional religious texts. So, does entomology find its way into? Do either of you know about that? I'll start with you, Erica, in terms of scriptural entomology
in the Bible. Obviously, the Great Plagues. The locusts were an obvious one. When the locusts come, they eat all your food. There is, you're not meant to eat. Was it Obviously, I'm not a religious person, so I'm maybe.
Crustaceans are a no-no.
Crustaceans are a no-no, and insects basically are crustaceans, so we can get in that way. The pigs being unclean, and a lot of that, they have terrible parasites in them. So you could have some with that, although they're not insects per se. There's the platyhelminths and all of that lot, aren't there? So I don't know, Matthew.
I can think of one, which is on the Tate and Lyle where the flies are around the lion. And I think that's Samson or something, right? They're bees.
They're bees.
Well, they're not. They're maggots.
Yeah. So ancient people of all sorts, both religious and non-religious, had all sorts of stories about where life came from. It goes back to what I was saying earlier on about the silkworm, and everybody thought, Aristotle argued this, that big stuff appeared in the usual way, the way we know, but little stuff, what he called bloodless animals, and that includes flies and bees and all that stuff, that generates from decay and so on. And what it says on the Tate and Lyle thing, which is from the Bible, is out of strength came forth sweetness. And the claim is that there's a dead lion and a load of bees have made their hive in there. They wouldn't, and then you can get the honey out of there. But people like Virgil have fantastic recipes for generating flies. You get a cow, an ox. Let's get an ox. You killed it, you buried it, you left it with its horns just poking out, you waited 30 days, and then you chopped the horns off, and a load of flies had come out.
That's not true.
There's a chap called, Yeah, probably true. There's a chap called Francesco Redi in the 17th century who actually tried an awful lot of these things. There were recipes for generating ducks from refuse piles, and he would go out and he'd do exactly what he was told, and he did it 3 or 4 times, and it never worked. So this was really important, because what you ended up doing, and Swammerdam was one of the people who did this, was to show that all life comes from an egg. Everything has eggs, including women. Swammerdam was also one of the people who was able to show that in the late 17th century. So there's this kind of unification of the natural world. And to get back to the religious question, Swammerdam's motivation, because he looks incredibly materialist to us, he thought that this had to be the case because God was perfect and the world was perfect. And anything that was kind of random, like stuff coming out of nowhere, that couldn't be true, because that would mean that God hadn't created a perfect world. So although his method and his conclusions were materialist, his motivations were a very, very strange form of Christianism, which involved Adam and Eve being hermaphrodites and all sorts of strange ideas.
You were just talking about that burial there of the bull with its horn sticking out. I immediately just remembered the old Chick Murray joke about the man whose wife dies and he buries her in the garden, and his friend comes around and said, "Why have you got a bum sticking out of the ground?" He said, "Because I've got to have somewhere to park my bike." Anyway, there we are. That's an old Chick Murray joke. One of the greats.
Did find a cadaver, a human cadaver, actually a wasp had built a nest in it. So there, I'm just trying to think of many examples of where you get Hymenoptera in corpses, and it's a secondary host association. It was a perfectly built wasp's nest, actually, within the rib cages. Would do that
because they like meat, but bees aren't particularly keen, are they? No. So I don't think there was ever a beehive in a deadline. I will go
right. Well, here's final question for you to deal with. Now, this is something that we don't know who sent this question in, but it's something they've been wondering about since they were 8 years old. If a fly or a worm can make it alive all the way up into the trunk of an elephant, my question is, if we know the answer, who was the scientist who figured it out, and how did they get the grant money?
So, interestingly, what I've got here,
there you go.
This is a botfly. These are the larvae of a botfly. And actually, this one comes out of a camel. But it's the titillator. That's its actual scientific name, which gives you a little bit of an indication of how it stimulates. And you get them in elephants. And what they do is they go into the pharynx. And when the maggot is ready enough when it's mature enough and it wants to leave, it irritates the lining of the nasal cavity and the mouth to cause the animal to sneeze. So it will violently sneeze out. And the camel botflies, there may be about 200 in the camel, and they will be snotted out in one go. A massive explosion of snot and botflies. Now, this was described by Smith in, I think, 1918. I could be incorrect. But yes, we have been studying these botflies for quite a while.
That's wonderful. What a great way to end, because I think it took us a long time to get to something that will put people off their tea. We got there a lot quicker with Infinite Monkey, but now it's 4 o'clock. It's tea time. We've got the sneezing camel. We've got the botflies, hundreds of them. That's wonderful. Thank you both for joining us today. That was one I highly recommend. Erica's book, 2 books on flies, which is natural history. They are, as well as the stories, which are utterly fascinating. The photographs are so beautiful, and again, it's that close-up world of seeing, that beautiful microscopic work. Matthew's book on the brain is absolutely wonderful and so interesting in terms of understanding the human mind and all of the work yet to be done about that. So highly recommend that. Helen, I will see you back next week with, as said, next week's show is all about sharks. And that's Steve Backshall and also Dr. Georgia Jones. And Helen will be back with us as usual. And reminder of Patreon as well. If you can support us via Patreon, that's absolutely fantastic. We make about 4 or 5 shows a week, some of which are free to all, some of which we do have to put behind the kind of Patreon paywall, but we're trying to make as much stuff available as possible. And I will, if you're bored tonight, I'm doing the Wolverhampton Literary Festival. Obviously, it's all online. And at 7 o'clock, I'm talking to Jed Mercurio, who is, of course, writer of Cardiac Arrest and Line of Duty, amongst others. And it turns out, actually, his A-levels were astrophysics and or physics, chemistry, and mathematics. And he has a very specific cosmological idea of the nature of plot and how long a series can run. So if you're not doing anything at 7 o'clock, join me and Jed Mercurio. That's the Wolves Literary Festival. And at 8:30, I'm going to be talking about my book, I'm Joking, So Are You, with Susan Murray. And it's the first time of the hundreds of events that I've done where I'm actually talking about the book with a comedian. So I'm looking forward to that. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.